Hey. All right, welcome everyone to What's the Schemata? And today I've got a really special guest with us. I'm speaking with Beatrice Ng-Kessler, who is a private practitioner working out of London, England, and also a Hong Kong expatriate who's recently started the Chinese Schema Therapy Academy in Hong Kong. So welcome, Beatrice. How are you doing?
Hi, Rob. Thanks so much. I'm good. Nervous speaking in
A little
English.
bit nervous. I know you're a bit of a listener, actually.
Yeah.
Talking backstage with you, I know that you listen to the pod sometimes. So what's that like,
Yeah.
coming on the pod when you're also a listener?
Yeah, I enjoy that a lot. Yeah, and learn a lot from it, from different guest speakers. I really appreciate that. I even think about, is that something cool to do it in my mother tongue? I do really think about that. But yeah, I find, there's so much effort that you have to put in. So
To do
yeah,
a podcast,
and
you
I'm very
mean?
happy. Yeah,
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 yeah.
lots of things
Yeah, you could do what's the schemata Chinese
in
language,
Chinese.
something like this. All right. Well, you and I work a little bit together and doing things, with disseminating schema therapy in Hong Kong, and we've been working closely together now for a little while on those things. And so I'm really excited to have you here today because we've been, sharing ideas a little bit here and there, and really, really excited to have you on board and really interrogate some issues around, applying schema therapy within a Chinese cultural context, and to some degree, sort of extrapolating that out to working more generally with Asian patients and those with an Asian cultural background, which many of us do, of course. So I guess I wanted to start this with you just to give a little bit of context as to how this came up as well as a particular interest. I've known you for a little while now, and my background in getting interested in this goes back to roughly 2015 when I started doing some
Hmm.
trainings in Singapore. I know you know these things, by the way, Beatrice. This is mainly for the listeners. And, at that time, there were very little trainings in Asia, accredited schema therapy trainings that were available. There'd been one or two here and there. Jeff Young had travelled to Singapore on one occasion. And so there wasn't a lot of access to those kind of accredited trainings in Asia at all, really, at that time. And it kind of struck me fairly early that it wasn't really a sort of business as usual thing. My job as a trainer, therapists were asking really interesting but also dicey questions about how the model applies in their culture. I'm talking about Singapore. So they would ask things like, what if the client would never speak up to their parents in an assertive way, like say in imagery out of respect? Or, what if speaking back to a critic in any dialogues might make the client feel worse in some way, have a sort of
Yeah,
iatrogenic
yeah,
effect?
yeah.
So some therapists started making suggestions for modification of techniques based on a more of an insider cultural understanding. And I remember really clearly in my mind, around 2019, I was doing a training in Hong Kong. It was a level 2 training. And I started thinking, and we had a really cool discussion with a bunch of guys that came back for level 2 training. I realized I was probably learning more from them than they were learning from me. That is that I was learning as much, perhaps more, about the cultural nuances as they were getting out of the level 2 training of the actual model. And I was really humbled by that, and it really sparked an interest for me. And I sort of ran back to Sydney, and at the time I had an academic position, and I started
Mm.
planning a small study with the help of a master's student, Alana Mao. At the time was doing her master's at the University of Technology in Sydney, and we collaborated with folks here in Hong Kong and also Singapore. So Cliff Siu from Hong Kong, and also Michelle Neo from Singapore, who had done the trainings. And we ran a small study looking at the experience of Asian therapists applying the model in their local context. So I will put that paper in the show notes, see if anyone's interested. But fast forward to last year, you and I start talking sort of over the email and talking about sort of issues to do with cultural lens and schema therapy, particularly Chinese cultural lens. We start planning some things in terms of some trainings in Hong Kong. And I really been enjoying your really thoughtful blog posts that you've been making for the past 6 months or so, looking at exactly this space and in my eyes, really fleshing out a lot of nuance about working in this space. So this is the background, I guess, I wanted to share with the listeners for today's pod. And so if I could now ask you the first proper question, and we start the interview proper. Why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit, Beatrice, and say a few things about your background that might show its relevance to this area of cultural practice and schema therapy?
Yeah, sure. So I have been practicing as a clinical psychologist for the 13 years right now, and I registered in Hong Kong and the UK. And back then, when I was in Hong Kong, I opened my clinic in like 2016. And by then, I have like around half of my clients are expats, which means they're not from Hong Kong. They can be from Asia countries, Europe, America. And then I took your class in 2019, I think. And I was accredited in 2021. And I'm the first one in China and Hong Kong. And then I was accredited as supervisor in 2024. So after I moved to London, in fact, I have more Chinese client, I would say, in with Chinese heritage, or not exactly they're from China or Hong Kong, but they can be from different countries. But they speak our language, or they have like Chinese parents. Um, and so it have give me different tastes of this, that how Chinese has been affecting us in a way, like the culture, the not just the upbringing, but also the parenting,
So initially
which
when
is
I met you roughly 2018, 2019. That was
yeah,
a set of trainings that we did at the time in Hong Kong, Chris and myself. You completed the trainings, and at the time you were working privately in Hong Kong
yeah,
with
yeah.
mostly Western expats. Did I catch that right?
It's like half half at the time in Hong
Yeah,
Kong.
like a
It's
mix.
international enough. Yeah, it's not a mix. So I have a lot of learning actually is from applying it with Westerners,
Yeah,
right? Because that for me is a tolerance training, I have to say.
yeah.
Because it's like because therapy takes so much of you, right? And when you're working, it's almost very intimate right there. And the way I have to do reparenting in a very, very explicit way, with someone from individualistic background. For me, itself is a tolerance training. Like how I have to make it very explicit to say those things in imagery and chair work. I often have goosebumps. You
Like the limited
know,
reparenting. So I'm imagining you mean things like, I care about you, I'm here for you. Is that what you mean? Like some of those more
yeah,
direct
yeah.
care
Yeah,
aspects?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like if I invite the client to imagine your mom saying this, I have to say something really close to where they are,
So
what their culture
you're
is.
putting yourself through exposure therapy. That's what you're saying.
Exactly.
And
And I
and
have like
and on your hierarchy, were your Western clients lower on the hierarchy? So was it easier initially to practice the model with your Western expat clients and to say those things, practicing, I guess, classic schema therapy with expat Western clients before then going on to your Chinese clients and trying to land some of these more intimate, limited reparenting type sentiments?
you can say that. You can say that in some way it is more direct applying. But at the same time, it's for me because I have that my own cultural background, making me actually not very familiar with those language. So that's like an internal tolerance training for me. But
Okay.
on the surface, I have to see like, oh, the client seems receptive to it. It seems really how things work. So like I have this kind of learning before, I try to apply to people closer to my own culture.
Yep.
And also in supervision, so I start to supervise people from different cultural background, like clinical psychologists in the UK, Germany. And I also see like when I need to verbalize the clinical knowledge, and I see that how the difficulty of it, like when I'm talking to an expat who is seeing an Asian client, for example, or the reverse, the Asian practitioners but CNN expats. So I see that I have to make them understand something through their own lens. And that have made me practice a lot of, how to verbalize those very tacit knowledge that I have learned from the application.
Yep. Yep. And I mean, how's your schema therapy journey been so far? So I know that you did the workshops, and then you ran off and got some supervision. Did you have who did you get supervised by? Someone from a Western background?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Except, C is my first supervisor, so she is also Chinese. But growing up in the Western countries, um, and then all of them from a Western, in more individualistic background. But I
Yeah.
have a fabulous experience, I would say. I have a totally um, very, very important experience. I would often say is a corrective emotional experience to me, being supervised by someone with different culture, because I can see like how my supervisor have been using schema therapist spirit in it, like the limited reparenting in the process. When I become a supervisor, I go through the supervision training. So I start to say, oh, that's why they are doing this. Oh, that's what they are doing. I
Mm.
start to see and reflect on my own experience. So I do feel this is partly why I'm very passionate with schema therapy. And I
Mm.
also think practicing schema therapy itself is strengthening my healthy adult mode too.
So you've been healing yourself along the way.
I think so. I think
Yeah, I
so.
think that's
It's
something.
very, very different from where I come from. The supervision experience is totally different.
There's a couple of threads there, like in my mind, and these things bounce around in my mind if I don't pick up on them. Um, One of them is that, and I can see that when I learned schema therapy within a Western cultural background, it was just learning the model. Whereas I can see you're wrestling with two processes. You're learning the model, and then you're doing a kind of cultural translation kind of piece where how does this fit within the cultural context that I'm from or that I'm working in. So it's a
Yeah.
tougher job. You're kind of, it's almost like you're translating, when you translate like a measure or something, you have to translate it and then back translate it. You know,
Yes, yes, yes.
that's very
That's such a
laborious.
good yeah, translator and back translator. That's exactly how I feel sometimes. So it's not just the language. It's not just these because it's not apple to apple.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's apple to orange. And then the
Yeah.
orange means apple and lemon. So it's just a little
So this is what I'm
so much
interested in
nuance.
selfishly. I want to learn. I want to know, because it's only been this last couple of years now. We have someone like you who's made it all the way through to being an ISST accredited supervisor, and that's very valuable for us also to have someone with that sort of knowledge of the model, but also the cultural knowledge. So you'll be very busy doing the back translation for the next 3 or 4 years while all that work's being done to sort of understand how the model fits. And I guess that's partly what we're doing today, to really interrogate that a
Yeah.
little bit more. So it's very exciting. Um, okay, and I just want to ask you another question here. I guess that, look, let's dive straight into the sort of big ticket item. It's often said that Asian cultures tend to be much more on the collectivist dimension versus more individualistic. What impact might exposure to collectivist cultural practices have on the development of particular schemas or coping modes?
I think one thing that we should bear in mind is that people from collectivistic culture, they used to see themselves as part of the group. It's less seeing themselves as an individual versus people with individualistic backgrounds. So it changed a lot of things of how we interact with one another and even how we perceive the world. So like the world that we grow up from is you are not taught to pursue your dream. You are taught to pursue, to contribute to the bigger good. So you can see the self-sacrifice spirit like that,
Or it could be
right?
that you're
Because
taught to pursue somebody else's dreams or the group's
or
dreams.
like the group, yeah, the group, and it's a virtue. You're promoted, you're reinforced, you will get appreciation, a lot of validation in from the authority, from your parents, your teachers. So you are taught that way. So and you can see that also partly would reinforce the segregation because you are not supposed to just talk be yourself, but you are supposed to follow some rules. Like the hierarchical society is very well received in most collectivistic culture. So there is strong ideas about how we should interact with one another, with your senior, with someone you should be more respectful. And what does that mean by that? And often obedience is trained since well childhood because that's the way you show respect or even I would say love to the authority. The obedience becomes part of the
Yeah.
promoted
So
virtues.
we in Australia are not very obedient. We're sort of we're convicts. Back in the days. So you know, yeah, this is a very different culture. The idea of hierarchy. You probably understand in
Yeah,
Australia, culturally we have a much more flat hierarchy. We really sort of don't like strong hierarchies, whereas
yeah,
where you're from, that's sort of a given that there's things are more hierarchical, and that's normal and acceptable, and even a good thing sometimes.
yeah, exactly, exactly. It's seen as something positive, and you're promoted by people with power, like your parents, right? Like your school teachers, right? Your coach, right? So it's very, very different upbringing. And it also apply in the therapy room. It's common enough the client will see the therapist as an authority. So they
Yeah,
follow your advice. So whenever you say something, they see it as this is the expert saying, and I have to listen.
and that can
And,
be a good thing sometimes.
it can be, of course, but at the same time, it can be a barrier for us to understand our client better
Yeah,
or in more depth because
or to
they
get to the
in
emotions.
exactly like how they can be free and feel
Yeah.
safe to express is something the therapists have to work on. And I see a lot of from my supervisor, I see sometimes that I feel like from a more individualistic background, they feel like they can just verbalize it. That means a safe space, right? To invite your client openly, like, oh, I want you to be feel free to express. And so they all mean good. Just the client may not feel it the same way because they may not have those experience. You hear something, but you don't know what does that actually can happen. So for the clients, they they hear it doesn't mean they really feel safe to express themselves. So the therapists have to do a lot more to create that safe space.
So you're talking about sort of other directed type schemas, self-sacrifice. You've talked about a sense of maybe enmeshment type schemas might be more common, or at least there's a more of a cultural pressure towards things like being very close to your family unit.
Yeah.
You've talked about things like conformity. So we're talking about things like
Yes.
the pressure to be more subjugated and to sort of so to keep harmony, let's say, in the group,
Yeah.
to put
Yeah.
your own
Yeah.
needs aside. Yeah,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
cluster of schemas. Can I mention Can I mention unrelenting standards? You didn't mention it, but is this can be a bit
Yeah.
more common as well?
Yeah. Yeah. In general, I have the impression too, like unrelenting standard is assumed. So with a lot of people with Chinese heritage. So you, you in the more layman terms, is sometimes you feel they're more competitive
Yeah,
because they have very high demands
yeah,
since they were very small. So they used to that. They talk to themselves that way.
yeah. So it's more normalized within the culture.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It's
I
assumed.
I want to have a little sidetrack here. I heard it was, I've got some, I supervise a few people in Hong Kong and Singapore, and the mental health system is very tricky. Let's say, particularly in Hong Kong, there's a lot of pressure on the system, for those in public mental health. And it's common that therapists are seeing a lot of clients. They have a very big list, a very big wait list.
Yeah.
It's a lot of
Very
pressure.
busy. Yeah.
And sometimes it leads even to the situation where a therapist might be seeing a client at best once a month. For some, it might be once every 2 months.
Yes.
Right? 2 monthly kind of contact. And it has been said to me more than once from these therapists, even though they are frustrated. They said, you know what, Rob, in some weird way, some of the clients, because the resource is so constricted, they come very, very motivated, almost with a sort of unrelenting attitude. Let's get the most out of this session. I'm not going to see you for 2 months. And absolutely taking full advantage of these sessions. So that was a sort of something I hadn't thought of that could be possible. I mean, what do you think of that idea?
That's very normal to me. I have been working in public setting in Hong Kong before. That's very normal. That's why therapist is very exhausted and sometimes overload the client with too much information by just speaking. Experiential intervention is very different from your psychoeducating your client. But a lot of therapists, because they want to give the most in that very short period of time, then they become like they talk too much because they want to give you so much things. They hope you almost.
And usually that would be a trap. Like we think that's a bit of a trap in schema, but it's tough if you're only.
Sometimes it affects the safe space. Like what I just mentioned about the role of authority within the therapy room. Sometimes it becomes, you are being a teacher right there too much. And the client doesn't actually able to feel how they feel by verbalizing it enough or by staying with their emotion enough to experience something. But the therapist is very rushed. So they have the stress of doing more. That becomes difficult for them to create that safe space because they may intervene too quickly and they may not pay close enough attention, of how the clients speak and listen to something that's unspoken. Because of our cultural background, there's a lot of things you're not supposed to say. Like your therapist say, oh, you must feel blah, blah, blah. And you may not feel that's exactly right, but your tendency will told you, yeah. You don't bother to clarify.
Yeah, and it's so tough if oftentimes in the process, things happen in therapy and then the client knows they're going to see you next week. So the process continues, but then they wouldn't see you maybe for a month or 2 months. And then they just got to hang there and sit with that feeling for a long time. So it is a big constraint, let's say. So.
Yeah. And also the rapport building, right? You have a lot of, almost like every time you see them, you have to build your rapport again.
So Beatrice, thinking about this dimension of collectivist versus individualistic, and what are some practical ways that you've had to adapt your schema therapy?
I would say you have to be quite creative in how you do limited reparenting, for example. I often tell my supervisee that, I consider serving tea for my client is part of my limited reparenting. Because in our culture, especially when you feel your client feel shameful, almost like there's not much thing you can say without acting on the shame when they are at that moment feeling really shameful. So you need something non-verbal, but you can't hurt your client, right? Most of the time. So you need to do something without saying too much. And I found serving tea is one of the really good way to do it in our culture. And another way is, I remember what they like that would add on it, they would feel the connection that I would give them like, oh, here is your favorite green tea, I put it here, that's all I say. When they're crying and I know they experience huge shame inside them. And this is one of those very little non-verbal stuff that we would need to adapt when it comes to the limited reparenting.
Yeah, so that's cool. That's a really, really practical thing. So you've got a big old box of tea in the corner, And you're ready to make
Yeah,
them tea
yeah,
if, if it feels right, if it feels like it's going to add to the connection and the care.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. When I was in Hong Kong, I used to have a bunch of tea for selection. So from the very beginning, I know what
Yeah.
this client would always select. So I would remember that, and then
Yeah.
when necessary, I would take, I would use those
Go and
information
get them some
from my
jasmine. Go and get them
observation.
some jasmine tea or something you
Yeah,
remember.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
nice. It
yeah,
reminds
yeah,
me,
yeah.
some of my Asian clients in Australia, they'll say things like, when I fight with mum or something, she won't talk to me. But then, eventually she'll come and ask me, like, she's made soup or something. And so
Yeah,
there won't be a sort of discussion about I'm sorry or something like this, or I'm trying to understand. But they'll understand that it's kind of over if mum's serving some food or soup and took some effort. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember there were another time that I bought the favorite food of one of my clients. It's a kind of a tart that is not very easy to find. But I prepare it and then for the session because she has lots of trauma, so she's very easy to dissociate at the same time. So that would help, like not just to build a rapport, feeling safe, feeling being careful. You remember what I want, you will extra mile to get me the
Mm,
cake that I like. But also that's part of the things that she can use to ground herself
mm,
when she feels so triggered.
yeah.
So I think that kind of thing matters, those very small
Yeah.
observations that you made that would convey the
Yeah, I did.
connection.
I was talking to Susan Simpson not very long ago, like last week, and because she, of course, working with eating disorders, and she was
Yeah.
saying that something similar pathways that some clients because in their family of origin, oftentimes they've been restricted of food, and
Mm,
they develop, she calls, almost like a food deprivation schema. And it feels
mm,
very similar to emotional deprivation when your parents don't provide for you in that way. You feel hungry, but you also feel unloved and uncared about. So she was saying there's a special connection between the provision of food in the family of
yeah.
origin and the provision of care, that it's a physical
Yeah.
aspect of care. Um,
Yeah.
so she
Yeah.
draws similar conclusions, not in a cultural way, but in actually a
Yeah.
cross-cultural way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can add on the cultural favor right here side, from more collectivistic culture, or I should say more Chinese culture right here, because it's very specific about food.
Yeah.
Food is something the parents would show love to their children. They don't say I love you, almost, you don't hear it. Um and but they cook the food that you like
Yeah.
and then they make you eat it. They make
Yeah.
sure you you eat enough until you almost explode. That's the parents showing how much I care
Yeah,
about you.
yeah. So okay, when I come to Hong Kong and my colleagues take me to Chinese food and I put on 5 kilos from eating Chinese every night, this is a way of expressing care and connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. That's I'm understanding now what that's about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely felt that. Lots of folk offers to come and eat, and it's all revolving around food.
Yeah.
So, what about imagery? I guess how does that land? I've got some ideas I've also tested out, and how have you had to modify your approach to imagery? We know also that imagery can be quite confrontational, like how with
Yes.
parents and
Yes.
whatnot. How have you
Yes.
approached that so far?
Yeah. I think the imagery with scripting, there's quite some adaptations right there, and also the empathetic confrontations with the client's parents. So sometimes the imagery is doing this work, and it has to be so tactful that sometimes I explain to my expat supervisee that you have an idea of you'll be parenting the client's parents. So, so in a way, that is actually the empathetic confrontation that we need. For example, like you don't confront the parents in front of the children because that makes them lose face in our culture.
So this is another
So
big one. This is another big cultural
it's,
issue
yeah,
about losing face,
yeah,
having face. Yeah.
yeah, Yeah, you can't do that. It's a no-no. You can't do that in front of the kids. You have to move them, those can we speak in a room? And but in the imagery, you have to also make sure the client can hear that. The vulnerable child can also hear how you are standing up for them and protecting
Okay.
them.
So you
So
might
you want them
modify
to hear? Yes,
in
yes. So
terms of
did you
having,
yes,
sorry, so I'm just trying to think this through.
yeah,
You might modify in terms of having the child in another room where they're not seeing
the
the
parents.
parent.
Yeah, usually I bring the parents in another room to speak, and I would make sure like the child can hear, but they
Yeah.
can't
So
see
you're
the
saying,
parents.
okay, little Jenny, I want you to go to your room now, and the door's ajar, so you can hear it. We're going to have a talk. You can understand what's happening, right? But this is a
Yeah,
conversation between me and your mother. Okay, you can
yeah,
listen in. I'm talking to mum now. Can you hear?
yeah,
Something
yeah,
like this.
yeah,
Do
yeah.
you
I
have a
usually do
script?
it as
Do you have some kind of
no,
modified script or anything? No.
no, no. From until I do supervision, I start to see my supervisor want it. But like I usually bring the parents to their room. So leave the child there. So if I can take the client's healthy adult with me, that would be the healthy adult's job to stay with the vulnerable child.
Oh, so you're being very
So
creative, actually. You know,
yeah,
that's what
yeah,
I can see. You using the cultural principles and being very creative.
yeah, yeah. And then I remove the parents, but make sure that they can hear it outside without seeing it. And the
Yeah.
point is not just that, to remove them so the parent doesn't feel to lose face, but also the child feel less guilty. If the
Mhm.
child can see their parents was being lectured, that's how they would feel.
Mhm.
Like, oh, someone talking because of me, someone talking to my
So
parents in that way, they feel too guilty.
So actually, the and this is what it means when people say, what if the rebuking, what if the intervention makes the client feel worse? It becomes
Exactly.
iatrogenic, and it could be that your intervention makes the client feel more guilty, right? And that's
Yeah,
not what we want.
yeah. So you are trying to manage it, but at the same time, I often encourage my supervisor like don't feel too discouraged. If your client do come out and tell you they feel guilty, doesn't mean you fail. You will have to see it as this is part of the package of healing as well. It's just natural that they feel that way. It comes together. It's almost like, for parents, if their child get hurt in some way, the parents feel guilty. No matter what, it's not about they really responsible for that accident, but they somehow feel they should do something.
Yeah,
You don't
yeah,
you don't
it's
see it as
normal.
a
Feeling
logical.
guilty is normal, like having
Just
some
accept it.
conscience. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Okay,
But
and
at the same
so
time,
the principle I'm getting, and this came up in our research too. Those sort of harsh rebuking that are classic schema therapy, where you're kicking out the parent and you're saying what's wrong with
yeah,
you, and these
yeah,
kind of things.
yeah. It
This
doesn't
is this
apply.
is this is not
It
in
doesn't
most cases
apply.
not recommended in a
Yeah, a lot of
Chinese and slash
yeah,
probably Asian cultural background. We had it in Singapore too, the same advice. This is
yeah.
almost always not a good idea.
Unless the parents are abusive.
Right. So if they're in the act of hurting a child in the image, but what
Yeah,
about verbally abusive?
so that's a good point because in the Chinese context, like a lot of critical parent mode quite enmeshed with the primitive parent mode. So they come with a good intention when they are being critical and demanding. But the language can go into a very primitive parent mode, like personal attack, like
Yeah, yeah.
being almost verbally abusive. So our job is to try to see when the client is here and when the client is being a primitive parent there. And in the chair work, for example, I would separate them into two chairs. In the imagery, that is much more tricky because the therapists they have to see it when is the time that you have to change your strategy when you're working with the parents. And you have to also psychoeducate the client. why you have changed from here to here, why you are trying to negotiate and talk to them properly, and then suddenly there's a moment you have to stop and ask them to stop talking. You don't humiliate the client anymore. So you're educating the client that what is totally unacceptable.
So your basic stance, usually in this cultural context with parents meaning in the image, is based on more of an empathic confrontation approach.
It happens often.
You're dialing down the rebuking, right, to something that looks more like empathic confrontation, even with a big emphasis on empathy and compassion.
And so this is the confrontational part more, but the empathetic part, how do we deliver it? Sometimes it's like you have to really go into the parents' world a little bit in your head. Like you have to understand how that parents may feel in that context. For example, like lots of father are not quite involved in any childcare or any household work. So the mom is super exhausted. So you have to speak from that.
So you're talking, look, I know you're so exhausted. You're doing so many things for the family. You're looking after your parents too. You're looking after 3 generations. You have all these responsibilities. Also, so showing that kind of empathy.
That's the language part. And also I will offer like, do you want me to help? How about you now go to West and I take care of your child right now? Don't worry, I will be okay to do it. Or do you want me to wash the dishes for you? So it's an act of service. That's the way we deliver love. You don't just talk because they feel a little, or like they don't feel so receptive from a collectivistic culture by just talking. But you have to do something.
Right.
That would help them to feel more, relief or soothed. And then the child also feel more relief from the guilt because you're really taking care of my mom right now.
And that's what it meant. What you meant when you're saying that oftentimes you find yourself looking after the child mode within the parent, within the image.
Yeah. That's why I told my supervisor, like, you're reparenting your client's parents right there.
Yeah.
And that is part of your work of reparenting the vulnerable child mode.
And you're keeping little mum in mind. So now we're getting very meta.
Yes.
But we're kind of keeping in mind the vulnerabilities of the parent and what they're going through.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Whereas usually, oftentimes, I think that's kind of missing in our model. It's kind of assumed, no, this is bad parenting. This has to stop. We're calling this out. We're going to call this out. It's less of that and more of the empathic confrontation.
Yeah. And then that's partly the culture, right? We define ourselves with relationship. So you cannot be so clear cut, like, oh, this is her and this is me. This is our relationship. So how do I navigate this part in between?
So, but things are more enmeshed in a sort of normalized way. That's what you're saying.
From the westernized lens, they would think, oh, this is a mesh. It does fulfill the criteria.
But in a normalized way. I want to say it like that.
Exactly. Like the filial piety, right? Like, you're supposed to match your parents' expectations.
Okay, you bring up an important point because one of the issues that has came up in the study is the issue of, as you say, filial piety. And this is a Confucian philosophical principle that seems to be important across most of Southeast Asian cultures. Can you define filial piety for us and describe its impact that it might have on let's say, the development of certain schemas and modes?
Yeah. And filial piety is something I would say doesn't exist in the individualistic culture. I marry a white guy, so I think I have some reference for the context. Because filial piety includes that you, as a child, you have to make your parents feel proud. The relationship have to be happy and peaceful, and you are expected to match your parents' expectations. You don't argue with your parents, and you have to please them. So that's part of the things that, this is more in a more individualistic culture. And you can see how it would very possibly facilitate some enmeshment right there.
Yeah. And this, it sounds like a nice idea in a lot of ways. right? That, younger generation looking after the older generation. I guess in the beginning,
Yeah,
it's older generation looking
yeah,
after the younger generation, and it's a kind of circle. The
yeah,
things that and you know this, the things that becomes difficult is when one or more of the parents are either mentally unstable or just outright violent or bullying.
yeah.
Let's just say narcissistic. Okay, if you had a narcissistic
That's
mother
very,
and
yeah, yes.
you have to be filial to this person. What kind of challenge does that throw up? And I'm going to put it on you now, Beatrice. How do you navigate this?
Yeah, it's so difficult. I have clients struggle with this kind of trauma, and it's very, very difficult because it violates your basic value system inside you that the whole upbringing tell you, or the whole environment educate you of. So it's really, really difficult to strengthen the healthy adult mode to an extent that you can see, there's some right there that I haven't met, I haven't have when I was smaller. So right there, like, we have to see a few things before we can go to the narcissistic, really pathological part. So we have the freedom to express our emotion and needs as one of the core needs, right? And in the filial piety, this culture, it doesn't promote that.
No,
You are not promoted to express your needs or
no,
emotions.
because it might
It's more
upset
the
your parents.
exactly the orientation is at the parents, not at the child, right? So that's a fundamental difference there. But at the same time, it makes us have the sense of intimacy and love experience in a very different way. As what you have mentioned, like the commitment, right? The commitment of taking care of the elderly or we taking care of one another, right? We have much stronger obligations in the way that we grow up and we are educated, that we are more concern or emphasize on our responsibility and obligation between one another. So the intimacy and the love is experienced through it. But when your parents is a narcissistic parents,
Yeah,
that becomes something really, really difficult because the parents themselves doesn't manifest in the way they're supposed to be. It's not
exactly.
where you're educated. They
And
don't
in
do
look
things
in a
for
Western
you.
culture, there's a much more of, well, if that's the case, your parents need boundaries. Okay,
Yes,
so
yes,
we would talk to people about setting boundaries with their adult parents and those kind of things. That becomes much harder when the culture says you
yes,
have to be filial to this person.
yes,
What's your
yes.
advice, like to your, let's say, to your clients generally who are stuck in that situation? How do you navigate that? The fact that, like, how do you promote their individuation where that's a core problem?
Yeah. And then you have to bring the client to see how their parents is not the typical parents if they're narcissistic, right, to that level. So you have to bring them to see their parents is not what they expect, but we're far from it to a level that's not average. So you have to bring them to see it because they can't see it.
So you still
There's a
have to
lot of
undermine, what you're saying is you're still undermining the parent in a way. You're saying that,
um, you can say undermining. You can say undermining as a term. I would say to bring them to see the reality. If the clients are narcissistic, right, they are doing it for their own good, but not for the children,
yeah, yeah.
or they are manipulative, abusive, and controlling.
And
And
I agree. I agree with you. Like, I think that's probably going to be useful, like to see it for what it is. But in a sense, within a filial worldview, that is can be seen as
how?
undermining the relationship, no?
Yeah. So the how is not, so I'm talking about the principle, right? To bring them to see it. But how to bring them to see it? One of the thing is the imagery rescripting is really useful. Sometimes when they revisit the childhood experience with some protection. For example, when I do the imagery rescripting, I would ask them to more seeing it as a third person perspective. So they don't become the wonderful child anymore because it's too much, too painful. If their parents are so abusive, they have to have that distance to see their own right there. so they can start to have a little, self-compassion to
Mm.
see that, oh, this is what that child suffered. Or if that's an even more severe situations, I may ask them to imagine that something that they tell me about their own experience happened to, for example, their student,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So another person that they care for, then they can have a little bit different perspective to see what is really happening. But it takes a very long time, this process,
yeah.
that they can really internalize, oh, this is this is actually what it is. It's not my fault. It's not me being disloyal.
I've
Um,
heard, I've had some Asian supervisees even use chair work in a very creative way to put, they've put sort of Chinese culture on a chair, or put Confucius on a chair, or this kind of things, to start a dialogue with the culture as a sort of critic,
mm,
rather
mm,
than talk to their parents per se, but to talk to
mm,
back to the
mm.
culture and to understand, where that comes from and the sort of message that they receive. Have you ever done anything like that?
No, because it's have to, the client have to be very educated and very conceptual, right?
Mm.
If we have to do a level of that, I haven't did that before, but I do have, except I don't usually put the parents on the chair unless in a quite a later stage of therapy
Yeah,
when the healthy adult mode is really well
yeah.
developed. That
Well, that's a
that
real
I
tip
may
that I
I may
found
put the
too. I found that, and that's even for non-Asian clients when they struggle with loyalty problems with their parents, is to be
yeah,
really, really
yeah,
clear that what we're talking to now is your inner critic, okay, and
yeah,
drop
yeah.
any parent metaphor. This is not your inner parent. This is your inner critic, and that's been giving you a hard time. And get away from the sort of idea that you're interacting with the parents. That seems to be really helpful in starting to help them with their inner critic without getting into a kind of guilt-inducing type issues. Yeah,
And we have to also emphasize in the process of that therapy, right? We have to emphasize that, the goal is for you to love your parents. So it's so difficult to love someone that's abusive,
yeah,
right? It's like, what do you mean by love them, right? So it's how can I love without being, within the filial piety? So what this love means. So you have to educate them, like you have to have that safe space and certain distance psychologically, physically, to feel you are safe and you're healthy in order to be able to love that person without, without yourself broken and
yeah.
damaged and unhealthy. So that is the way that you have to
So there
educate
is
them
some
to
ways
hope.
that you're setting boundaries. The boundaries are just not as dramatic, the way you put it. Like it's not that you have to leave the home necessarily and go and get your own flat unit and tell your mum I'm not, I'm only coming over once a month or something. It's less dramatic. You might be stuck there. That's another feature actually I found in Asia. I think house accommodation is very expensive, so there's often multi-generational living, where
Mm,
people are living with their parents and their grandparents for a long time. That's a separate issue, but it does present challenges to clients who are trying to individuate and to set boundaries. Yeah, you remind me like one of the, and I wonder, we haven't spoken about this. One of the strategies that I've seen work around this is where there's a less dramatic boundary setting, is that I find that the children, adult children, would start to individuate more outside of the house where they have their own
yes,
life,
yes,
have their own
yes,
friends, they have their own, they're doing things, they're probably being naughty as well. But
yes,
when they come
yes.
home, they're very much saving face for the mum and filial. Um, and so there's the kind of two worlds going on there as well in the way they set boundaries.
Yes, sometimes it's, oh, I can say the FH would appear that way. And that's exactly why sometimes, if it depends on how healthy or what is my client's goal in therapy. But sometimes for some clients, they are more, in a healthier stage and seeking more self-growth. I would I would talk to them about how you can really feel intimate with your parents. The so-called confrontation is not actually a separation, but seeking them, you really feel intimate with them because you are really honest, because you are really authentic, because you're really willing to take the risk that your parents is angry and don't feel happy of what you're saying, but you're still taking this risk to let them understand you. That's actually a path to be actually more intimate by a little bit real. That may sound confrontational in a Chinese context. So that's a risk assessment right there of how you would take it, handle it tactfully. And would you pursue that path to seek that intimacy within your family? That's the client's choice.
Yeah, makes sense. And what about, I mean, the other thing that came up in our study was the expression of emotions. So cultural differences in the expression of emotions. Do you find that's more of an issue? Is emotional inhibition more common in your Asian clients? And is there a need to adjust your approach?
I do feel, I'm not sure they are entirely equal to emotional inhibition schema. But I do feel like the most Asian clients, they tend to be more reserved in their emotional expression, including myself. So I can easily relate to how how they don't easily verbalize how they feel because that's not in their culture. They don't train to do that.
Are
Hence,
you less emotionally inhibited now that you're a schema therapist? Like, did you heal some
I
of that, or
I
did you change that?
I would say, like if I'm communicating with an expat, I would definitely have a different mode of
Oh, wow.
expression
You have
compared
different
to when
modes.
I'm
You've got
talking.
two
Yeah,
modes as a
yeah.
therapist. You got
I
like
I I feel that's
Chinese
different.
mode
Yeah,
and you got Western expat mode, and you can switch
yeah,
modes.
yeah. Yeah, I feel the difference in the way that I express my emotions. But I do need some warm up, I would say, compared to the people with individualistic culture. They are more just right away they can express. But for me, I learn the words, I learn the tools, not necessarily I will apply it. It really
Yeah.
depends on the context because it's also overly expressive if it's in some more reserved or collectivistic culture. It becomes over. People are
It's
like,
too
oh,
much. Yeah.
yeah, that's your monologue.
It was
You
put to
know?
us in our study, like one of the threads was, it was kind of explained that it's not that everyone, let's say in Hong Kong, is emotionally inhibited. It's just that the average in the bell curve is different. So the bell curve kind of moved, and so the most expressive person in let's say in Hong Kong is still within the normal range of a more Western sample, right? It's just that the average is less on average than a Western sample. So you can imagine the bell
That
curves
makes
kind of
sense.
move to one end, but there's so much overlap. Like on average, people are still within each other's averages. I don't know if I kind of got that right, but so and actually, I'm pretty sure it was Cliff was saying this. He was one of the study authors. He was sort of saying that he believes that when people learn to do schema therapy in that culture, it's they shouldn't probably try to go and be Rob Brockman or to be their trainer, the Western trainer, and to do it in such an expressive way. It might be a little bit of a mistake, but to find the right bandwidth, yes, to turn up the emotional resonance, but within the window of tolerance for the culture.
Yes, yes, yes. That's a very good way to put it. Yeah, yeah.
I found
Within
that
that
really
bandwidth,
interesting.
yeah, and within the window of tolerance. That's exactly it.
So we do
Otherwise, you
want
you, you can't attune to your
So we do want
clients.
our Asian schema therapists to be more expressive. We want them to take the model seriously and to promote emotional expression, but also to keep in mind the window of tolerance, that they don't have to do it exactly the same way that they learn, or
Yes,
because it might be slightly inappropriate. So they've got to find it, and it's always
yes.
hard to define where is the window, right?
Yeah, yeah. And 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 that's is there's two ways to see it too. So that's what you said. I find it very valid and applicable. And also we also need to bear in mind your client may feel some grief there. It may sound very weird. So because if you adopt a way to be more explicit and verbalize, you have to sacrifice some kind of connection that you used to feel from no need to speak like this. You know what I mean? That's the connection that from our own culture, like our intimacy is coming from I don't speak my needs and you know it, right? But you have to willing to sacrifice that part before you can learn the language and to be very explicit and become much more verbalizing your emotions. So there's a two things happening there. And the clients have to also experience this part of grief before they can earn those things that you have just said.
Okay, okay. Now I've got two more questions for you, and then I think we can start wrapping up. What general advice do you have for the Asian therapist who wants to start their schema journey? What sort of advice do you have for them? Is it worth it? Is it something that you would recommend?
Of course, because I think that's something really important for us, for people from our culture. Partly is I also see the benefit of, able to be verbalizing your feelings and your needs would help in setting boundaries. When things are very unspoken, it's very difficult to set boundaries. The boundary is very vague. So I see in general that's something really how Schema therapy bring in to this culture is really positive and helpful.
Yeah. And what advice do you have for the schema therapists from non Asian backgrounds who invariably will work with Asian clients or clients with diverse backgrounds and coming from collectivist cultures? What advice do you give the non-Asian, non-collectivist sort of background therapists about working cross-culturally?
I think the most important one, I think, is that the therapists have to understand they have to build a safe space with their clients. And that's something they may feel like a little constantly working on because they have to show them this is safe to express themselves and they have to show they are very liberal, they're very open. Um, they may not know everything, but very curious about what the client's really experiencing. So this is like you are expanding the client's window of tolerance in terms of expression. So it's not so direct, like I give the language, please use it. It's more like how they can feel they can do it. And you are not judging them. That's something really
Yeah.
important as a basics.
It's so interesting. Like the thing that I always try to, probably my own framework is I try to reach out and let them know that I realize that things might be a little different for them culturally and open up,
Yeah,
as you say, a safe space for that, that I don't assume anything, I don't assume one way or the other, but I'm curious about, okay, where did you grow up? What were things like in your background? How can that affect your problems? How can that affect this space? I'm curious. I want to learn. I want to understand. So I try to make a safe space culturally and to let them know I'm not assuming anything at this stage, one way or the other. Because I also found the opposite is also true. Sometimes you can assume, oh, she's from Hong Kong. It must be like this. That's also kind of not cool on occasions too. So I think when you say safe space, I do, of course, agree with that. For me, it's this
yeah,
safe cultural space, like where I'm not really an
yeah,
expert on that, but I'm curious and I want to understand, and I'm willing
yeah,
to make some adjustments, together.
yeah, yeah. And also like having this, you know, a little cultural elements in our head that is not used to trying to oversimplify the clients in front of us, but more like pointing us to ask a more appropriate questions.
Yeah,
Like, oh, is that something you mean this way? And can I clarify?
yeah.
Or I see you a little hesitated just now. would you tell me what had just happened? Like you pay close attention and ask more appropriate questions.
And this could be the last question because and I think you also sit in a good spot with this because you also have your husband is a European and you have children also that are European and Chinese. Is the aspect of people who come from diverse backgrounds and how this also makes the work more interesting, more diverse. It's not a simple story, right? Like sometimes people have a background where they're partly from here and partly from here. How do you deal with those kind of third culture kind of people?
That's we always have to be very curious. That's how I feel like, you want to know this person. And maybe you don't put it in a box. Like this is Chinese person, this is Australian. You don't put them in a box. You see them as a person because the Australian may be living in China for 20 years, right? Like,
Yeah.
so there is a lot of merging there that we want to see that person so that we can attune to that person. So we become more aware of the stereotype that in our head or the assumptions that we have. So when we have more of this awareness, we can be better attuned and connect to the clients.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, that's been invigorating, Beatrice. Sort of overview of some of the issues and some of your work, and I know that the process is going to be ongoing. There's still a lot of work to be done in understanding how this work sort of fits within different cultures, and we're really happy to have you heading up some of that work. I just wanted to mention a few things. This is a sort of plug time of the podcast. Number one, I'm super excited. Our Cambridge Guide to Schema Therapy has officially being translated into simplified Chinese. It's called the Chinese edition. So that will be coming out around September, I believe, for those, because I do think there'll be a lot of Chinese and Asian schema therapists listening to this podcast. We've got some training coming up. This year we already ran level 1 training in Hong Kong once. We have one cohort already graduated. We have another training coming up in June of this year in Hong Kong, in central Hong Kong Island, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And also we have level 2 coming up later on. I think it's in October or September. That's with Chris Hayes, also with you, Beatrice, training alongside him and myself. And if you want to check those out, just go to schematherapytraining.com and then click on Hong Kong and you'll see the links there to go through there. I know also, Beatrice, you have some other trainings going on and opportunities in this space.
Yeah, and in June, I'm going to give a one-day class in Cantonese. So it's more for the Canton speaker. I think that's the first Cantonese class in the world. So I'm going to demonstrate some, experiential intervention, like what I've just described, and there will be video demonstration as well. So I'm very excited to it. The class is almost full right now, and I'm planning to give another 2 hours class in September online, which probably name something like cultural adaptation in schema therapy, and it will be in English. So both classes can be found from the Chinese Schema Therapy website.
Yeah, which is ChineseSchemaTherapy.com. And you'll see Beatrice has all her blogs and everything up there. And I really recommend her blogs on these matters. They're very in-depth and very interesting. So it's a good place to start. I have to mention, last plug, I promise, guys, because I've also got some really cool partners over in Singapore who support our work over there also in spreading the word about schema therapy. And that's Annabelle Psychology over in Singapore. So if anyone's a bit closer to Singapore and they want to get some schema therapy training, you can go to Annabelle Psychology and you'll find the training and then schema therapy training. You can see Chris and I get over there usually once a year as well and do our level 1, level 2 trainings. Beatrice, thanks for coming on board and sharing your work with us. And thanks everyone for tuning in. See you guys.
Thank you. Thanks for having me too.
Thanks, Beatrice. Bye.
Bye.